You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. Well, this morning it was reported that the Russian human rights ombudsman, Vladimir Lukin, has declared that he is ready to challenge the 2-year sentence for 3 members of punk group Pussy Riot unless it is commuted. Last week, Maria Alyokina, Yekaterina Samutsievich and Nadezhda Tolokonnikova were convicted of hooliganism motivated by religious hatred. It stems from back in February when members of the group Pussy Riot staged a 30-second performance in Moscow's Cathedral of Christ the Saviour. The trial began in late July and raised much controversy in Russia and globally. Ahead of the verdict in their case, the Russian Orthodox Church issued a statement appealing to the authorities to show clemency within the framework of the law. Indeed, according to a poll by the independent Levada Center in Moscow, 44% of Russians supported the trial and believed in its fairness, while 17% did not. But among the roll call of musicians who voiced support for the group were Madonna, Sting and Paul McCartney, while the European Union and the United States called the sentence disproportionate. The Western media has portrayed Pussy Riot as freedom fighters, but are they? Is it fair to conflate what they did with demands for freedom of expression, or are Pussy Riot simply good self-publicists? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined by the former Kremlin advisor Alexander Nekrassov, and also here in the studio is Katya Glod, who's a Robert Bosch Fellow from the Russia and Eurasia Programme at the Chatham House think tank. And on the line, we have Tanya Lokshina from Human Rights Watch Russia and Paul Craig Roberts, an American economist and columnist for Creators Syndicate. He also served as an assistant secretary of the Treasury in the Reagan Administration and was a former associate editor of the Wall Street Journal. Thank you very much for joining me here on The Voice of Russia. Tanya Lokshina from Human Rights Watch Russia. Russia's no stranger to high-profile court cases. Why do you think the Pussy Riot case has got more headlines?
Well, you may know we've been working in Russia for the past 20 years, which is pretty much as long as the contemporary Russian state has been in existence. And I can't tell you that without a shadow of a doubt, this case has become the most prominent one. I'm talking in particular about the intensity of the public campaigning around the case, both in Russia and abroad. And I'm also, of course, talking about the high-level statements made by all sorts of international officials in connection with the case. All in all, somehow the Pussy Riot case became a trial of the centuries. Why did the image of those 3 young women, rather fragile and student-looking, facing the heavy Russian judicial machinery, somehow epitomized for the international community what precisely is wrong with the Russian judicial system and with the human rights situation as a whole? I can only guess. 3 women, they just looked extremely compelling. Secondly, I believe that we can talk about a sort of a snowball effect here. They are performance artists, which made the case of great interest to other artists in the world. And once several celebrities spoke about their case,
Okay.
and then naturally people all over the world were also paying attention because all those celebrities were speaking about this particular case.
Okay, Alexander Nekrassov, former Kremlin advisor, were you offended by their stunt in the Moscow's main cathedral?
Every normal Russian was offended by that because this is the cathedral which was blown up on orders of Stalin and rebuilt as the national symbol of Russia, as a nod to Stalinism. And for these women to dance there and to shout out obscenities. By the way, they were not shouting down with Putin, they were shouting obscenities. This is offensive to the Russian nation. And to turn them into dissidents, I think it's embarrassing. And what Tanya was saying just now, I couldn't believe my ears, because these are hooligans. Okay, the treatment probably was too harsh. I think the judicial system, I agree with that, is not as effective as it should be. But to say that this is a political case, that they are protesters, this is ridiculous.
Alexander refers to the sentence being too harsh, Katya Glod from Chatham House. But in fact, I mean, there was a case relatively recently where 2 neo-Nazis in a region, the Orenburg region of Russia, who were sentenced to 6 years in jail for daubing swastikas on synagogues. So in relation to that, it's not actually that bad, is it?
Well, maybe in relation to the particular case which you mentioned, it's not that bad. But it's not about drawing swastika on synagogues. Here we are talking about freedom of expression. And to hand out such a verdict of 2 years, basically for singing a prayer song, as these girls called it, in a cathedral, even having full respect to the status of this cathedral, it's definitely too much. We don't know any similar case that has been treated in the same way in Europe, for example, when people would be prosecuted and would receive 2 years in prison. Prosecution might be, yes, maybe they would receive a fine in the end, but definitely it's an important attempt to express their free expression and to express their thoughts.
But you say that there's no similar case in Europe. I mean, in the United Kingdom and London, following the riots, there were 1,200 people who were convicted, one of whom was given an 18-month sentence for throwing a rubbish bin off the top of a building. Now, okay, we can say that what they did was wrong, but it's actually not that unprecedented, is it?
No, but we have to differentiate between the cases where people try to express their thoughts and between actually doing something that may affect the public. If that person was throwing something that could have damaged physically people who were standing on the ground, that's one issue. This particular song by these girls did not damage anyone. All atheists, I mean, they can also then claim that, you know, they're being spiritually tortured by religion believers who are saying that these girls gave them a lot of moral pain, etc., which was their claim.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Brendan Cole. With me is the former Kremlin advisor Alexander Nekrassov and Katya Glod, the Robert Bosch Fellow in the Russia and Eurasia Programme at the Chatham House think tank. On the line, we have Tanya Lokshina from Human Rights Watch Russia and columnist for Creators Syndicate, Paul Craig Roberts. Paul Craig Roberts, I'd like to turn to you. What did you make of all the media furore?
It was needed by Washington to demonize Russia and Putin for getting in the way of Washington's destruction of Syria. I mean, that's a real serious crime, unlike Pussy Riot's performance. And the hopes of Washington to destroy Syria have been frustrated by the Russian government and its opposition. Part of Washington's propaganda. If you're the dominant language, because the Anglo-Americans have been the dominant force in the world for 3 centuries, and so the language is prevalent everywhere.
In what way was Washington trying to stir things up?
Well, the whole focus is shifted to gangster state Russia from gangster state Washington.
Are you saying that's an unfair categorization?
Laws, what's happening in Syria is a war crime, but we don't see that being protested. Legally, as far as I can tell, there's nothing sensational about the case of Pussy Riot. I'm sympathetic with the women, but I think they've been foolish into being used in behalf of Washington's propaganda. And as long as, you see, what's so funny is it's Russia and China who are demanding that international law be respected by Washington.
Okay,
that's not the debate now. The debate
Sure.
is, Russia's suppressing free speech.
Sure, I'll turn to Alexander Nekrassov. It was brought up by Katya Glod here in the studio about this is an issue of freedom of speech. Do you see it as such? Because
of course not. No, of course it's not a freedom of speech. First of all, it was offensive to millions of Russians. And as I pointed out already, because this is a symbolic cathedral, not only a religious place, but a place of revival of Russia. It's a place which was built on public donations. It's basically a no to Stalinism symbol. And for these women to go in there, by the way, they did not shout anything against Putin. This video on YouTube was then later altered. They were shouting blasphemy. They basically went there with a specific purpose to upset. And of course, all the feminists, all the liberal press started saying things, like, oh, freedom of speech is being curtailed and so on and so on. It is unbelievable what is going on. And I, by the way, agree with Professor Roberts on this case that the Western media did stage a propaganda coup, and that they do everything now possible to detract attention from, let's say, Libya, which is a hellhole now, which is absolutely anarchic, which is a formerly, a country which was prosperous, is now in total disarray. They're covering up what's happening in Syria. They're covering up what's going to happen in Iran. So, of course, they'll be using anything to accuse Russia of not having freedom of speech and freedom of expression, simply because it will suit them when there will be a debate anyway in the United Nations or at any conference, and they will be saying, oh, yes, of course, but is it for Russia to talk about human rights or other rights when it's suppressing freedom of speech in its own country? I'm actually shocked by the way it was spun, by the way this whole story was blown out of all proportion, and by the way people are saying, well, it was too harsh. I can tell you hundreds of cases. The latest one in Finland, when a group was arrested even before they tried to do the same thing and are now facing 2 years in jail.
Katya Glod, Alexander says that it's been blown out of all proportion.
No, I don't think so. Well, first of all, if I may disagree with what Alexander was saying, that it was blasphemy and sacrilege. Actually, the surveys that have been conducted recently, just before the trial, show that even the Russian public, they have changed their opinion on that. Because if in the beginning, when the women were taken to court and the trial started, the people were saying, the majority of them were saying, yes, it's blasphemy and sacrilege. However, the survey conducted just before the end of trial showed the opposite, that actually the most popular answer among the Russian public was that the women protested against the involvement of the church in politics. And this is also shows how the Russian public opinion has changed, because there was this debate and because there was this discussion about the free speech, about the involvement of church in politics, about the interaction between and interrelations between church and state and Vladimir Putin's government, first of all. So therefore, the fact that it was blown out of all proportion, I actually think that it has made a significant impact for Russian society. For them to discuss these issues is very important, because it shows it's a process of maturing of their political culture and understanding and being more tolerant towards freedom and towards tolerating such values as freedom of expression and free speech.
But they would have been able to, they have staged several stunts outside of churches and haven't been arrested, or if they have been arrested, they've faced fines and things like that. I mean, as Alexander Nekrassov was pointing out, this was a symbolic, this is the center of Russian Orthodox faith. And I suppose you could say that, I mean, if that were to happen in London, they would be arrested. Replace the idea of a cathedral with, say, a mosque, and if 4 white men came into a mosque, pushed aside an imam and started shouting obscenities. In any country in Europe, that would have been met with a very, very firm response. Are we simply making a judgment on the fact that this is happening in Russia rather than in somewhere else?
Well, I personally don't think so. My opinion is the following: that, well, first of all, these ladies who sang there, they did not interrupt any service or mass. They did it when there was no mass going on. It was quiet place. They did not push anyone aside, and they did their stance, whatever they considered this to be. So I definitely don't see it as being something, blown out of all proportion in this sense, and don't see it as having deserved this verdict that these women have received.
I'd like to turn to you, Tanya Lokshina from Human Rights Watch. An organisation such as yours, I guess, defends the rights, basic human rights. People of all faiths should be entitled to gather peacefully in their place of worship, shouldn't they? I mean, that human right is actually guaranteed by Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and we saw a flouting of this in the Pussy Riot case, didn't we?
Well, I would like to reiterate Katya's point. In fact, the 3 women walked into the church not during Mass, but when the cathedral was practically empty. There was no religious service happening, so they were not disturbing any prayers. And in fact, the slogans that they sang or shouted, however you want to put it, were political as opposed to sacrilegious nature. Finally, I was really disturbed about the discussion of how, in fact, a little severe this particular punishment is, considering the nature of the crime, because whatever they did, the Christ the Savior Cathedral in Moscow is really not a crime, but rather a misdemeanor. And in particular, Russian Administrative Code does have a provision regarding offending feelings of believers. But instead of that particular provision, they were in fact indicted with a criminal offense of hooliganism. And if you look into the definition of hooliganism according to the Russian Criminal Code, hooliganism is a crime which can only be perpetrated with the use of weapons, and there's definitely no weapons involved here, or if motivated by hostility or hatred towards a particular social group. That would naturally include a religious group, and the court tried to argue that the three women from Pussy Riot were in fact motivated in their actions by hatred towards Orthodox Christians, but frankly this argument does not hold water. It just makes no sense whatsoever. So not only the sentence is unduly harsh, but the very indictment on criminal charges was 100% unfair.
This is the Voice of Russia. We're discussing the Pussy Riot case in Moscow with Alexander Nekrassov, Paul Craig Roberts, Katya Glod and Tanya Lokshina. Alexander Nekrassov, you said that the sentence was too tough in your view, but this shouldn't have been a criminal case, should it have? Is what Tanya Lokshina from Human Rights is saying correct?
If the judge would have given a soft sentence or a fine, we would have had other Pussy Riots getting into other cathedrals, shouting obscenities, shouting, and there was no political message. Excuse me, no. I've checked the soundtrack. No. They were just blasphemous. Second, there was a huge group of them, not just 3 women. There were 15 people with electrical instruments. They just didn't play. So it was basically not a political, it was an act of hooliganism. And they chose, the place is at the altar. Now, for any person who understands religion, this is the sacred place, the most sacred place in the whole cathedral. If they at least would have shouted their obscenities somewhere in the corner, that's one thing. But they chose the altar. They knew perfectly well. Somebody was guiding them, obviously. Another important point. Nobody knew those women. They don't have a single hit song. And suddenly Madonna comes to Moscow and she knows about them. And so Paul McCartney suddenly knows about them. And Sting knows about them. And other pop stars know. The reason why it was created, this whole row, is because of the celebrities. Because nobody would have talked about them a lot if there were no Paul McCartneys or Madonnas there. And I think for Madonna, who doesn't have a single, by the way, proper record to her credit, to interfere into politics like that, this is just, disgraceful. Like it is disgraceful for Western politicians and politicians generally who got involved in this scandal to start saying things like, oh, freedom of speech. You remember those student demonstrations in London? Well, that didn't really, care what they were talking about. The police was very heavy-handed. The sentences were passed, by the way, jail sentences. Nobody talks about this anymore.
Tanya Lokshina, what's your response to that? I mean, if it hadn't been for the celebrities, we wouldn't know anything about this. This group doesn't have any singles, they don't have any music, they don't have any videos available. We would never have heard of them. And his fundamental point that it took place on the altar, that is sacrilegious, isn't it?
I still think that many people would have heard of them anyways, but naturally that sort of attention, that sort of intensity of the public gaming was owed to a large extent to the celebrities involved. But then why don't we ask ourselves how come all these celebrities actually got involved with the Pussy Riot case and started advocating for the 3 women who were by that time behind the bars awaiting trial. And the reason it happened is simply because as artists, these celebrities are very much into protected freedom of expression.
They were plugging their LPs and CDs.
They were antagonized by what happened to the 3 women, and they wanted to help out. Because the sort of persecution that they faced was completely disproportionate. And yes, Totally. If not for the celebrities, fewer people would have found out, and fewer people would have supported the woman from Pussy Riot. But then, hey.
Tanya, can I turn to Paul Craig Roberts? Paul Craig Roberts, is it strange that a case like this seems to get headlines in the United States and also a response from the American government when among American people there's little criticism of, say, for instance, the case of Bradley Manning, who's been in jail for something like 800 days without charge, 3 strikes and you're out laws in California. Is it strange that a case like this makes the headlines in the United States?
Oh, it's very strange. As I said already, it's part of an orchestrated propaganda operation. We had last week a United States Marine who had spent 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan. His name is Brandon Raub. He published something on Facebook about how he had come to the conclusion he'd been used illegally by the United States government to commit war crimes, and he was picked up instantly by the local police, the FBI, the Secret Service, committed to an insane asylum. No charges were made, sent off to a mental hospital, and finally yesterday a circuit judge ordered his release and said this whole thing had been grievously illegal and unconstitutional, and he had simply expressed his opinion. And there's no protest whatsoever. I don't see Human Rights Watch on the case or Amnesty International.
But more fundamentally, Paul Craig Roberts, what does this say about the state of Moscow-Washington relations when they speak out so vehemently against the Pussy Riot case?
Russia is in the way of American hegemony, going to pay a price, and so will China. And that's what this is all about. Look, the worst thing about this is that important organizations like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, are becoming identified with American propaganda. They're being seen by intelligent people who are not easy to fool as adjuncts to Washington's propaganda mechanism.
Can I put that to Tanya Lokshina from Human Rights Watch? Paul Craig Roberts says that your organization is part of this propaganda machine, acting on Washington's behalf. What do you make of that? What's your view of that?
Well, with all due respect to Dr. Roberts, such allegations are just completely ridiculous. And it's not only officials from Washington that made statements in support of the Pussy Riot band, the 3 women who actually were on trial, but also top-level officials from numerous member states of the European Union. Frankly, Washington has nothing to do with it as such, and I'm just sort of puzzled by the very idea that the prominence of this particular case is being viewed by some well-endowed with the benefit of higher education as a result of vicious political propaganda by the U.S. State Department or whatever other official American organization.
I want to turn more broadly to the issue of protest in Russia, and I'll turn to you, Katya Glod, from Chatham House think tank. Earlier this year, we saw protests in Russia. What do you make of a case like this, which is effectively about opposition, I suppose? Would it be fair to say that this actually undermines an opposition movement? Because people in Moscow and people in Russia, if they want a genuine opposition movement, they want an opposition movement with policies, with somebody that they can get behind, some people that they can vote for. And it's all very well seeing the chess grandmaster Garry Kasparov thrown in the back of a van and Pussy Riot being led out of a courthouse. But it does nothing to advance their interests, does it?
Well, I think we have to separate between organised opposition and be it political parties or certain groups led by Navalny or by Kasparov, for example, with some public protest. And the Pussy Riot case, I think, can be attributed to the latter one. I fully agree with Alexander what he said here, that the case was prosecuted to this extent because had it not been prosecuted, we would have seen something very similar in another cathedral in Russia. And that was exactly the bottom line and what was behind the idea of the authorities, Russian authorities, to hand on such a heavy verdict, because they really, this case should be seen within the context of the recent protests that we have seen in Russia starting from December. And it has become an important element. And when these protests are joined by youth, I think that is becoming particularly worrying for President Putin and for his government. And such a harsh verdict to put these women in jail was actually to make a showcase, to show to the youth that any anti-Putin activism will be prosecuted in the same way. So,
are you suggesting that the order came directly from the Kremlin? And what proof
yes,
would you,
I am very inclined to think
that?
so. Well, because first of all, as we have been discussing here, the case went out of all proportion, exactly because the women mentioned the name of Vladimir Putin there, and
they didn't mention it in the cathedral. That it was the video that was uploaded onto YouTube. The words Vladimir Putin were added. So actually, in the cathedral
we don't
itself.
know. I mean, that's for the first time that I hear this information that these words were not there. How it has been described so far, and of course, I was not present in the cathedral, but I doubt that Alexander was present there, and I don't know why he takes his evidence that these words were not included. But the words Virgin Mary chase out Putin or drive Putin out, they were present during the song, during this prayer. So therefore, this was highly personal action of the women.
I think it came out in court, though, didn't it? It came out in court that those words were added onto the YouTube video. But anyway, look, be that as it may.
The point is that the women, the prosecuted women, in their statements in court, they said several times that their action was not targeting religious believers, that they did not want to hurt their feelings.
Well, they chose the wrong place then to express their political views, because you don't go and dance at the altar. And by the way, you know what the irony is of the situation? Putin's popularity went up. Because most Russians do not agree with what we're hearing here. Most Russians do not support this sort of opposition. That's actually not exactly true,
because the recent public service and the public survey conducted in August has shown a dramatic drop in Putin's popularity. It was 12 percentage points since May, and his rating has been dropping down since 2008.
I'd just like to follow up this point on opposition, on the opposition movement. Alexander Nekrassov, former Kremlin advisor. What do you think that these stunts, or this case in particular, how does it affect the desire for a strong opposition political parties within Russia? Does it undermine it? Does it help it? What do you think?
I think it undermines it, because the Russians see the opposition at the moment as a joke, because we don't have a single leader. All those Udaltsovs and the others, they have nothing to suggest, nothing to propose. There is no policy. And when we see these women pretending to be part of the opposition, more Russians will be disillusioned. And another important thing is that when we had those mass protests, these opportunists, as I call them, they try to pretend that they are acting on behalf of these hundreds of thousands of people. They are not. They have nothing to do with them. And I spoke to many of the people who were there at the square, at the Sakharov Avenue, and they said to me, no way were we supporting Boris Nemtsov or Udaltsov or Navalny. No way. We don't even want to be associated with. We want to stop corruption. We want to have changes. But no way we want to be associated with these people. And the more Pussy Riots will happen, the less support opposition will have among the people. Yes, liberal media will continue their games, but the opposition will disintegrate eventually.
Well, sadly, we've run out of time, but I'd just like to finish by thanking my guests, the former Kremlin advisor Alexander Nekrassov, Katya Glod, Robert Bosch Fellow in the Russia and Eurasia Programme at the Chatham House think tank, Tanya Lokshina, Human Rights Watch Russia, and Paul Craig Roberts, American economist and columnist for Creators Syndicate. Thank you very much for joining me here on The Voice of Russia.